Okay, hopefully that worked okay. Hi everyone, my name is Elizabeth and I am going to do a little talk for you tonight called Presenting the Past, Living History in Newport. So as Vicki mentioned, my name is Elizabeth Sulak and I'm the Director of Public Programs for the Newport Historical Society. I started as the staff interpreter for school programs about 15 years ago. And in this photo, I am my alter ego, as some people call it, Polly Wanton, a young woman who lived in our house museum at the time of the American Revolution. But over the years, my position has evolved. Today, my position focuses on all facets of public programming, author lectures, walking tours, school field trips, developing YouTube content, helping with retail merchandise. But what I'm most passionate about and what I really love is living history, costumed historical interpretation. So today I'm going to offer insight into our philosophy on living history, and I'm going to discuss a few of our events as mini case studies. And along the way, I'll touch a little bit on our research methods as well. So who are we? The Newport Historical Society is a public history institution. That's history that's made for the public. It's made to be accessible for all. A core focus of our living history philosophy is bringing history to the streets, surrounding the public with history. So our living history events are site-specific. A location's history is the inspiration for what we do. We work to create historical events in their original location or just steps from that location. So this means that our events are centered in a city setting and they are in or near the center of town. What do? We are presenting the past, not from behind ropes where visitors will observe in a passive way. We look for creative ways to engage the public. We want them to be a part of the action. And the photo that you see here is a great example of that. We have a crowd, walking with a group of living historians during a riot for an event we did about the 1765 Stamp Act riots several years ago. Another core focus of our programming is civilian life. Many reenactments highlight military history, and while this is important, we feel that there's a lack of civilian-based events. So we want to show daily life and its related struggles, women's lives, children's activities, and other underrepresented stories are an important part of our programming. But that's not to say that our events are not, ladies who are dressing up and wearing silks and taking tea. I love to feature conflicts in our programs. So as I mentioned, we did a riot one time. We did an impressment for another event. Life in the city immediately following a battle are examples of some conflicts that we have featured. And the photo that you see here shows a scene from an event that highlighted the burning of a Royal Navy sloop in 1769. As you can kind of see by some of the surprised faces in the background, there's a sense of spontaneity with this action. It really, catches people by surprise. We are in a downtown city setting, and it really brings to life an incident in a very unique way. Visitor engagement is a very important part of what we do. I often include an angle for visitors to get involved, offering icebreaker questions to act as a hook for visitors to feel comfortable to learn more. One example I love to highlight is a spy challenge from a British occupation event a few years back. Visitors were invited to act as a spy in a British occupied city, and they were encouraged to find the living historian who was also a spy so they could share important intelligence information. Our undercover spy was the woman who you see in the picture here. So perhaps not someone that you would have thought who might be a spy, but she had a lot of fun with this and was really able to get kids and families and people involved who wanted to go take that extra step a little bit further. Another angle that we're trying out next week is a mystery for visitors to solve. So for this particular event that's coming up, there are items that are missing, and the public is invited to help discover why are these items missing. So they'll learn that there was actually a theft ring that had been orchestrated by two women in the mid-1770s. So our programs are, of course, research-based. We pair scholarship with progressive living history. And to help our interpreters prepare, we offer a balance of research, secondary sources like scholarly articles. We do have a scholarly journal that the Historical Society publishes called Newport History. So I can often pull information from that source to share with everyone. And of course, other sources like notes that are compiled by researchers specific to the event that we might be portraying. Of course, primary sources like historic newspapers are a favorite for many of us to draw from. But I don't want to overwhelm our interpreters. Oftentimes we'll pull together an interpretive summary that has the key points for people to share with the public, to share with visitors. This has ranged from a written piece, and it's evolved. A few times we've been able to have this piece recorded so that it was like a podcast for people to listen to, perhaps as they're driving. And more recently, we had a Zoom lecture that was just for our participants with an expert speaker so they could kind of get engaged and ask the particular expert questions that they might have had. And that was, of course, recorded and then shared with people afterwards who couldn't make it. But the goal is to help synthesize the research materials so people can arrive feeling prepared to talk to the public about the event at hand. This also helps to ensure that visitors hear key points about the event that we're creating so that there's consistency in communication. Historical clothing is, of course, very important to us. How our interpreters present themselves is very important. It sets the stage for how they are perceived by visitors. Our reenactors are required to meet certain clothing standards specific to the years that are portrayed. We didn't want, of course, we don't want anyone running around in styles that hadn't been invented yet. So we have clothing standards for 1765 and 1770, which are on our website. And I will share a link in the chat feature when my portion has concluded. So that way, if anyone wants to check them out further, you can. I personally don't do juried events. Oftentimes, if someone wants to get involved with one of our programs and they don't have the clothing, or maybe they have a few pieces of the clothing, I'll lend them garments from my clothing stash. The Historical Society has a very small collection, so I can sometimes fill in those gaps with clothing there, but I really try to pull together enough to get them to attend the event, kind of dip their toes in and get started. And I find that this approach works really well to help people step in and get to experience the event and inspire people to continue to improve and grow. And we find, of course, that some living historians are really into the clothing aspect. And I want to share a photo of an example of this. We did a dressing program a few years back, and it was about ladies who were dressing for a ball. And our living historians here had beautiful sack-back gowns that were so well documented. So I wanted to show us the inspiration for those gowns along with the recreated gowns together. Our programs are based in first-person historical interpretation. Lead roles are asked to stay in first person during an event. And just in case you're not familiar with first person, it's representing the past as if you're someone from a particular era and do not know the present day. In contrast, third person interpretation, you're speaking as if you're a modern individual. And we have an approach that we developed called first person that I like to call first person light. It's also referred to as near first person. It allows the living historian to move from the 18th century to the present day to better answer visitors' questions. Can help minimize confusion from visitors. You can probably imagine, our events taking place in a downtown city setting. A lot of people show up at these events not knowing that they're going to be stepping into, 1765 or 1775. So it allows the living historians to kind of be a little bit more honest about what's going on. And also, they can admit if they don't necessarily know a particular fact to answer a question, they can say, oh, perhaps this museum website or this database might have an answer to that question, so it's not as limiting as first person interpretation can be. So in terms of getting started doing all of this, research is essential. Researching your persona, figuring out who you're going to portray, why you're there, what's your backstory that led to that particular moment in time. And of course, primary source research is the best part, and it can be absolutely fascinating. In terms of getting started with a persona, I like to use research methods like the historical newspapers. There's a historical newspapers database that's just fantastic. Letters written by specific historical figures. I'm fortunate that I work for an organization that has a very extensive archive of historic documents, so I can often pull from those sources to share, to develop a persona, or to help someone who's representing someone specific for an event. But of course, digging through museum website databases to get a sense of the material culture that would have been available to that particular figure, or into perhaps in the orbit of that particular figure. I am personally a big fan of Stacy Roth's book, Past into Present. I think it's a fantastic resource. It's a little dated. It was published in the late 90s, but the techniques that are discussed are very relevant to what is practiced today for historical interpretation. Specifically, the book features a character development list that I think is super helpful to figure out who you are, what you're doing. You're taking the time to answer those questions can help you arrive feeling prepared to be that particular figure, and then stay, in character, in your persona during the particular event. Our events are a little unusual, so I wanted to offer 2 mini case studies that outline two of our common program formats. The first format is for our smaller events, which are generally 20 to 30 people. And then the other format is our larger summer event, which is usually 50 to 75 people, although we did do an event for another institution where we had about 110 people, so quite large for a civilian event. The first event I will talk about is Colonial Wedding Expo. It was a program that we presented in February of 2020. It follows something that's often referred to as the science fair format. There's a theme to the event. In this case, it was everything about 18th century weddings. There were tables that were set up around a large 18th century room for visitors to interact with the living historians. In this case, as I mentioned, we featured 18th century weddings as if someone was stepping into a wedding expo, but all of those stations were colonial themed. There were stations that talked about wedding cakes and foodways, which is seen on the photo on the left. There was a bride getting her hair done, which is seen on the photo on the right. There was a groom preparing for his wedding. Different religious wedding traditions were discussed. Courting, there was an engagement, preparing a woman's trousseau. So all different aspects of a historical wedding. And then, of course, we concluded the event with recreating a wedding ceremony of a bride who was marrying a British officer, which actually took place during the Battle of Rhode Island. So that's kind of in a nutshell, that's our smaller winter event. And actually next weekend will be the first time that we're presenting an event in this format for the first time since 2020. So we are quite looking forward to that. Our larger event the last 2 summers has focused around the French in Newport, and our summer event is very much rooted, it's very site specific, and it's the format that really inspired everything that we do for our living history programming. The last 2 years, we've featured the French occupation of Newport, either in the summer or the early fall of 1780. We had all of our properties open with living historians stationed inside the building or around the building. We've had about 50 living historians. Some represented specific French figures, like Rochambeau is seen on this photo on the right, or the Marquis de Chastellux on the left, as well as people representing average 18th century citizens. So the goal is to show that interaction between the military and civilian life at a turning point in the revolution. And we've been fortunate the last few years to have generous grant funding for this event, thanks to the National Park Service and the Washington Rochambeau National Historic Trail. We've partnered with the Museum of the American Revolution to present their first Oval Office project, commonly referred to as the George Washington Tent, at our site in downtown Newport. So if you're curious to learn more about these larger summer events, there are videos on our YouTube page about these programs. So if you scroll back a little bit, there's some videos about the Stamp Act protest, videos about the burning of Liberty, as well as the naval impressment event that we did. I would be remiss if I did not recognize that these events are not possible without our amazing team of volunteer living historians. These are people who travel from across much of the East Coast to come to Newport. You know, our programs are generally 1 day or 2 days, 1 to 2 days. So if they're willing to come from so far away, you know, they're really passionate about what they do. I feel that it's my goal to empower them. I give them homework. I set expectations. We have a Facebook group or a group chat where we'll share thoughts and research and insights. Essentially, I want to make sure everyone is connected and arrives feeling prepared and ready to go on the day of the event. I also recognize that we couldn't offer these events without such an amazing team of people who are so dedicated to carefully presenting the past. So thank you for letting me share what we do. I hope this helps you gain some insight and perhaps think about your living history journey with a slightly different perspective or approach to historical interpretation. Happy to answer any questions, and you can also reach me at the email address seen here.
Which has been your best attended event?
That's a good question. You know, we partnered with Revolutionary Spaces to do the Boston Massacre in March of 2020. And that one, I feel like we had a lot of people at, but I have no idea what the actual head count ended up being because it was at 3 different sites in downtown Boston. Boston is obviously a much busier city, so I think that they would have higher numbers than us. I mean, certainly the summer events downtown at Washington Square do gain the most foot traffic, the most visitors. So I don't know the exact numbers, to be honest. Hard to say.
Are there any other questions for Elizabeth?
I have one.
Ruth speaks. Yes.
Yes. Finally, I'm using my husband's laptop and all kinds of crazy antics. But anyway, Liz, first of all, thank you so very much for doing a great summary of what it looks like a pretty thorough preparation on your part. Do you have kind of a checklist when you broadcast that you're recruiting interpreters? Do you kind of ask for some feedback for them, or how do you feel like your initial approach prepares them for the depth of what you expect?
Well, we always have a Dropbox file of research. So I'll make different files within that Dropbox file, primary sources with newspapers, specific to the event, secondary sources, any articles that I can find, specific to Rhode Island history, Newport history, or, tavern life, depending upon what the scenario is. Sometimes I'll have a personas file if I know people are representing specific figures and I know of documentation for that figure. I'll have that kind of in there. So I really rely on Dropbox to help communicate all of the research, and then I come up with different spreadsheets, different formatted spreadsheets to communicate what the schedule is or where people are supposed to be. So that's kind of how we communicate in a broader way in terms of recruiting people to come. I mean, we have a great network of living historians in the greater Boston area. So it's a lot of people that I know throughout the, living history reenacting community here in this region and across the Northeast. But obviously, Facebook and social media are great tools to get to know new people. So sometimes people will message me or I'll see photos popping up. I'm like, oh, wow, that looked really cool. I wonder who that is. Let me, introduce myself. So just kind of general networking in that way.
Thank you. That's great.
You do have a question in the chat.
Okay.
I don't see a name, but it says, Elizabeth, as an historical interpreter in and around your time period, may we call upon you with the questions we may have to help with our presentation in our home area?
Oh, of course. Yes. My email address was on on the screen just now, and I'm also on the website, newporthistory.org on the staff page.
Okay. Do we have any other questions for Elizabeth? Well, thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was a nice presentation. It was very informative. And I will ask my partner Ruth if she would like to introduce the next presenter.
I think that is Rebecca Franco. Yes, your second, and Davis is asked to go last this evening. Rebecca has a background, I think, in theater and costuming, and very enthusiastic when we had our Zoom meeting a couple of weeks ago as shuffle here, family program manager. She's going to talk about some things that she feels relate to the type of engagement that they do at the Museum of the American Revolution. And she's also going to address, hopefully, our newcomers, since she's a newcomer herself. Thanks so much, Rebecca.
Of course. Thanks so much, Ruth. And it's so nice to see everyone. I know there's some familiar faces of folks that I've known from my time at the museum before. So I'm very excited to talk to you all today. I'm going to do my own screen share, just like Elizabeth. So I'm from the Museum of the American Revolution. For anyone who is not familiar with our location, we opened in 2017. We're located in downtown Philadelphia on the corner of 3rd and Chestnut. And my role in at the museum is as family programs manager, and I exist within the education department. And I would be remiss if I did not mention that one of my colleagues, our senior gallery interpretation manager, Tyler Putman, is also works right alongside me and is the one of the driving forces of our Living History event. So I will be quoting him often this evening. So the mission of our education department is to produce well-researched, high-quality programs that draw on the museum's collection and exhibits to present multiple historical perspectives through the eyes of people who lived during the American Revolution. And in doing so, we empower people to think critically and encourage historical empathy amongst our guests. For anyone who's unfamiliar with that term, historical empathy is the theory that we want to encourage our guests to engage in a dialogue about the people of the past. We want them to understand that the American Revolution was a real event that happened to real people who did not know the outcome ahead of time. We want them to consider not only the viewpoints of people with whom they may closely relate, but with whom they may actually share nothing in common. Soldiers, sailors, women, people of African descent, Native Americans, even loyalists. We believe that by imagining and empathizing with the experiences of the people of the past, visitors from adults to families to the hundreds of school children who we have visit us every year become more empathetic in everyday life. So we use living history interpreters, objects, and costumes to help us achieve this sense of empathy. When a guest is presented with a wool jacket or a cocked hat or a 6-pound cannonball, the distance between those people of the past and themselves melts away, and they feel like they are part of the story being told, making it not so far a leap to understand that they are the future of the revolution today. And this is why we feel that it's so important that our objects, our costume interpreters, and even our tableaus are highly researched and historically accurate down to the stitching. One of our largest living history events is our annual Occupied Philadelphia. Since 2017, one weekend every fall, we gather an amazing group of volunteers and staff and hired individuals to portray the British occupation of Philadelphia in the fall and winter of 1777. Visitors interact with British soldiers, camp followers, market vendors, sailors, middle class, low class, and even high class citizens that reflect the diverse world that these people were living in Philadelphia in the 18th century. The volunteers and individuals who we invite to participate in Occupied all exist in the middle of what my colleague Tyler, and I'm going to quote him very clearly on this, he likes to call the Venn diagram of reenactors. So on one side, we have people who are passionate about interacting with the public. And on the other side, we have people who are passionate that the buttons on their shirts are correct. And what we are looking for and what we want is we want people who exist or want to exist in the center of that Venn diagram. We want you to love talking to the passerby who are curious about what you're doing and what you're wearing. And we want you to be wearing researched and built and correctly built costuming so that it continues the authenticity that we strive for in all of our object-based work. In terms of sources, we are extremely lucky that we have a bunch of different things. These are just some of my personal favorites. And as Ruth said, as somebody who has just recently in the past 4 years started to get in on this, for Philadelphia specifically, these are some really great primary sources that we are able to point to. One of the best ones is the Diary of Elizabeth Drinker. She was a Philadelphia Quaker who had a lot of opinions and wrote them all down in her diary continuously from 1758 until her death. We also have the Journal of Sally Wister, who was a 16-year-old girl and who lived outside of Philadelphia during the occupation and who kept an almost daily journal during that time. And when it comes to clothing, especially for the middle and lower classes who most often are represented in newspaper advertisements, the book Wives, Slaves, and Servants' Girls pulls together newspaper listings from 1770 to 1783, many of them from Philadelphia, for indentured servants and enslaved people who had absconded from their owners and wives who had run away from their husbands, and that all of them contain detailed descriptions of what they were wearing and other clothing that they brought with them. So it gives us a really excellent snapshot of, as what Elizabeth was saying, what people were actually wearing during that time. And so that you're not coming to Occupied or coming to one of our other living history events wearing something that was not going to be in style for another 10 years or so. These are just a few of the sources. We are also extremely lucky that, like Elizabeth, we have a number of primary sources like newspapers that are available to us on America's Historical Newspaper Database. We also have some very basic bullet points that we put together in our interpretive plan that if anyone is interested, I'd be happy to share with you. We have a number of other living history events that happen over the year, including our Artisans and Makers events. We have a Peels Company event that we usually have in December, and our traveling First Oval Office project, which actually Elizabeth alluded to before for coming to visit for their wonderful French weekend. We go to a number of wonderful, fantastic locations like Newport and New York and Mount Vernon. And even right now, as we speak, the tent is in Houston, Texas. George Washington was never in Houston, Texas, but we don't let that stop us. We bring it down there anyway. And the thing that all these events have in common is that we bring to them all the diverse people and stories that existed in the 18th century. We really like to rely on that. We try to make sure that every single piece of what we're wearing and what we're doing really represents an accurate portrayal, because when somebody can look at your clothing or look at your handling objects that you're holding to them and handing to them, if they come off as real, that is a connection with people that goes far beyond any costume you can purchase at Party City, honestly. But yeah, so that's most of mine. And I just like Elizabeth, I'm happy to take some questions.
Okay, are there any questions for Rebecca? Any questions? I don't see anything in the chat.
I have a question.
Okay.
I always have a question, at least one. And the question is, you do quite a bit of interpreting yourself as part of your job. What is your favorite persona that you've worked on so far?
Oh man, I think at this point, my favorite persona that I have that I've been working on is I've recently been working on putting together a for our Artisans and Makers. We've been working on putting together a myself and one of my male counterparts is working on doing a seamstress tailor connection to sort of give this idea that not everybody was super great at making their clothes, and not everyone was super wonderful at fixing their clothes. And some people had the means of being able to do those things, to have other people do those things for them. I think that my other favorite one is always of the camp follower. I know that that's a pretty popular one, but especially when you're following George Washington's tent, we actually have some really great primary source information about the women of Washington's lifeguards, their wives and sisters who were following along. We have some really amazing documentation about who they were and what they were and their specific jobs that were involved serving the companies that were serving Washington. And I think those are also my favorite, because we have actual names for those people.
Ooh, we'll look forward to hearing more about those women, won't we, Liz Zulak? Yeah.
We also have a question in the chat. Do you have a place or email in which we can call upon should we wish to seek information from you in the museum for our interpretation?
Of course, I will put my email in the chat. That is no problem. And you can also probably find it I imagine you would be able to find it on the website. I haven't checked recently, but I will drop that into the website right now.
And another one is the documentation available to the public, the documentation regarding the soldiers' wives.
It was something that was written by a historian and reenactor who we use often, John Reese. He's done specific work around both not only camp followers and the women of the Continental Army,
Right.
but so specifically of the women of Washington's Lifeguard. And so I will, if you want to send me an email, I will happily send you the paper, but I think you should also be able to find that pretty easily within his work online.
Okay, I know I have found quite a few articles of his based on.
We love John Reese.
Yes. Okay, thank you so much. All right, I will have Ruth introduce our next speaker.
Our next speaker is someone I haven't known very well, but I've known for quite a while, admired him, Davis Tierney, who is at the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia as a director of interpretation. And he's a frontline guy. He's right up front on many of the events that he plans. And we're just delighted you could take time, Davis, tonight. You've actually come from the front line, I think, to be honest. Thank you so much.
I wish I had. I got sick this weekend, and so I couldn't end up going, which was a big bummer, but I'm here with you guys, so that's what's important, right? But anyway, I do have one thing that I think will help to explain what the heck the Frontier Culture Museum is. It's a little bit weird if I could screen share it, if that's not too much trouble.
Yep, you can go ahead and screen share.
All right. Wants to share the contents of your screen. Hello. Yeah, I'm just gonna give you guys the entire screen. All right, so there's that.
There you go.
I wanted to pull up this, and I'm gonna go ahead and hit the go button. This map of the Frontier Culture Museum, because this is gonna be relevant when I explain what the heck the Frontier Culture Museum is. But first, I want to tell you guys a little bit about myself. I'm Davis Tierney. I'm currently the Director of Interpretation at the Frontier Culture Museum, but I've now worked at a bunch of living history sites. I started working at Jamestown Settlement when I was 14 years old. From there, did a bunch of internships and worked at Colonial Williamsburg for a while. Did stuff in their wig shop, did stuff with schooling groups, did stuff in military programs. Went to Old Fort Niagara to manage their interpretive program, and now I'm here at the Frontier Culture Museum. So I've been to a bunch of different sites and seen how a bunch of different sites do events. And so much of it made me really mad. So the great thing about when you're the director is you get to do things the way you want to do things, and that's nice. I got to see the things I didn't like, the things that didn't work, so we could apply stuff that worked at the Frontier Culture Museum, which was lovely. So that's a little bit about me. The Frontier Culture Museum is a little bit weird. So we are a living history site that is open every day. We always have living history going on. So for us, when we're putting on an event, a big part of what we're thinking about is what is the added value. And I'll get back to that in a little while. But what you're looking at in front of you is the basic layout of the museum. There are two halves of the museum. If you look on the top half of the map, you'll see the Old World section of the museum. The exhibits there, like the West African exhibit, English exhibit, Irish exhibit, German exhibit, are meant to show what life was like for various settler and enslaved populations before they left their home countries. So when you're in West Africa, you are in West Africa, you are in Nigeria, not showing you what West African people are doing in Virginia, and same around the rest of the old world exhibits. If you look on the bottom half, you then see our American exhibits. That includes our Native American site, which has been renamed. I'll happily rant about the name that's on this map. This is an old map. Don't pay it too much heed. And then the rest of the exhibits that basically follow a timeline of how the culture of the Shenandoah Valley developed once all of these culture groups, these Europeans, West Africans, and Native people were in the same place. So that's kind of the elevator pitch for what the Frontier Culture Museum is. And my job within that is to run those living history programs. So as we talk about what kind of events we run at the Frontier Culture Museum, they fall into a couple different categories. I'll blow through the stuff that's not as relevant to this group really quick, but we do stuff like, for example, we'll do a lot of community events. When we run our Juneteenth event, that has a living history component, but that is primarily a reason for us to collaborate with our local Black community and do something fun. So the focus isn't necessarily pure living history. They come out and do a big modern Juneteenth celebration, and we're happy to have them, right? When we run our Fiber Festival coming up in a couple of months here, that is an event that's going to include a huge amount of modern fiber artists, as well as our living history demonstrations augmenting it. So not every event is strictly a living history event, but when we do events that are strictly living history, I mentioned earlier this idea of added value, right? So we do living history every single day at the Frontier Culture Museum. So what the heck can we do as the Frontier Culture Museum to do something that is different and special and worthy of an event? I'm going to stop screen sharing because I think you guys have stared at this long enough. So let me get back to Zoom. Here's the thing. Every day at the Frontier Culture Museum is a civilian event. Our Tuesday is a civilian event. It's what we do all the time, right? Did the screen share stop successfully? Yes, it did. Okay, cool. Every day is a civilian event for us. So when we're thinking about what we can do to do something different, do something special, do something added value, in a lot of cases, unlike what I think a lot of the living history reenacting hobby generally has been leaning towards, pulling away from military stuff, we lean into it because we basically never do it otherwise. So for us, that's the special one-off. And so we lean really heavily into it. With that said, we will put in a lot of effort to make sure that we aren't just talking about bombs and bullets, that we are talking about all the different facets that go into a war, the civilians who are caught up in those conflicts, all the different populations involved, et cetera. And I'll get a little bit more into that as I talk about specific events. But within our reenactor events, we like to think of them as being on a sort of invite/juried basis. And what I mean by that is there are certain people who we as the staff know, and we know like, okay, that person's 100% solid. We know their intern's good. We know they're good with the public. We know their kit is good. We're going to send an invite directly to them. But if we've got somebody coming to us who we've literally never heard of in our lives, we are going to run that person through a quick application and jurying process. It's not to be mean. It's not to be exclusionary. It's just because we don't know that person. We have no idea whether or not their kit is awesome or they are awesome or whatever. So we have an application process for people we've never met before, not in an attempt to be exclusionary, just to make sure that we know who we're dealing with. We very much believe that we need to add value not only to the visitors when they come out for one of our events, but we need to set ourselves apart to the reenactors. We've got these people who are traveling from all over the East Coast. We have people travel out from Oklahoma for our last event. We need to give them a good experience. If we do not give them a good experience, a fun experience, a unique experience, they will get bored and our events will slowly wither and die. So we try to go out of our way to create really unique scenarios and give people really unique opportunities to do really unique, weird stuff. Sometimes that's physically what you're doing. Like our site is not archaeologically sensitive. All of our buildings are brought from elsewhere to this piece of dirt. And what that means is that we can dig camp kitchens. We can cut down trees. We can do all kinds of weird stuff to the property that a lot of more sensitive sites can't. So leveraging things like that to try and give people more interesting experiences, and then maybe they'll get at your standard sort of big three reenactment. We tend to lean pretty heavily into third person at our events. We're not opposed to first person, but we like to use it as a special sauce rather than the entire cake, right? So I know you guys had Emma Cross a couple years back do one of these presentations for the group, right? Thumbs up, yeah. Yeah, Emma's a really amazing first-person interpreter. I worked with her at Williamsburg, and interacting with her at Williamsburg gave me the, I don't know if it's the headspace to realize I, Davis Tierney, am never going to be as good at that as someone like her. I'm never going to come close. I'm never going to touch what she's able to do. What I can do is talk to people in a third-person context. So that's what I choose to do. So what we do is we find people like Emma. We find the people who are really ace first-person interpreters, and we build vignettes and programs around those people, right? That way, when we do put out a first-person program, we know that it's going to be absolutely rock solid. And for guys like me who really struggle with the first-person thing, we can lean more into our third-person interpretive skills instead. So it's just a matter of basically, what's the word I'm looking for? Playing to people's skills, right? I'm not a good first-person interpreter. If you try to make me do first-person interp, it's not going to be a good time. It's going to be bad. So don't, right? Let's use these people how they can be used. That said, when we do our vignettes, we try very hard to make them impactful. And I'll go over some of the vignettes and stuff that we've done as I move into the events. Another thing broadly about our events, we do not do battles. A lot of our events are very military focused because it is the special thing for us. It's the sort of thing we don't do every day, but we do not do battles. The most closely resembled thing to a battle that we have ever done are we've run these interactive patrols at some of our events where we will actually have a small group of dudes take a large group of public into the woods and have the patrol getting ambushed, and I'll have them react to contact. It's not long. It doesn't involve blasting off 20, 30 rounds. It's a quick little violent thing that's meant to simulate the type of uncertainty, the type of movement through the woods you'd expect to see in fighting on the frontier, right? And really the goal of that is on both ends, not just the actual shooty shoots, how we set up anticipation on the front end of that. So that way, when the first gunshots go off, every member of the public ducks a little bit, and the smoke billowing around in the trees on these trails in the woods and so forth. It becomes a very sensory experience. And then we have a period at the end where those people can sort of decompress and talk about what they just saw. The last thing I'll mention, sort of big picture policy-wise that we do, is that we have a policy towards Native interpretation that some people love and some people hate. Our policy, and this is increasingly the policy of museums across the country, is that if you are not a tribally enrolled Native person or are not sponsored by a tribally enrolled Native person who is at that event, you cannot portray a Native person. This is increasingly industry standard. I'm sure the other museum people could speak to it. But at this point, it just comes down to, do we want to work with these communities? The answer is yes. Those communities have very explicitly told us what they want. And what they want is to be able to represent themselves and not have themselves represented by other people. So because they've so clearly told us what they want, we respect their wishes because we like working with these communities. We want them to be a part of our programs the same way we want our Black community to be a part of our Juneteenth programs. The last thing I'll say when it comes to organization is, for us, Facebook is God. We do so much of our organizing over Facebook. If you've ever attended one of our events, you've probably been added to one of our event pages, and that's how we disperse most of our information. We found that it's just logistically simpler in a lot of ways than trying to do huge convoluted email lists and things like that, which, like, maybe that just makes me lazy. I don't know, it's whatever, but it's the way that we can get that information to people with a minimum amount of work on our end so that we can focus on other elements of event planning. So I want to talk a little bit about two events we ran, our two biggest events in the last couple of years, and some of the big takeaways that we had from these events. So the first one I'll talk about is actually the last major event we ran, Captive Beyond the Mountains. So this event is meant to recreate the period between, I think it's, 1779 and 1780, where a huge number of British and Hessian prisoners of war were held captive in Albemarle and Augusta counties. We're in Augusta County. A lot of these guys were Convention Army captives, so people who were captured during the Battle of Saratoga and trekked all the way down to Virginia. And there's just all kinds of fascinating stories that come up from their time in Virginia. So we decided we would do an event focused on what's going on in Augusta County when these captives are here. We have a lot of great sources for this. We were able to send a team of people down to the Virginia Historical Society in Richmond to go through the Crockett's Western Battalion Orderly Book. They're one of the units guarding these captives. They went over the public store records to figure out things like okay, what cloth is being drawn for the guards? What equipment, food, cloth is being drawn for the prisoners? How are they dressed? What are they eating? Those kind of things. Getting into Jefferson's papers and Patrick Henry's papers and things like that, so that we can learn more about what is going on with these people while they're in Augusta County. And using all that information, we tried to stir up a whole bunch of really interesting programs and vignettes and inform our KIT standards. So, for example, we ran a vignette. We've all been to, or many of us anyway, have been to an event where we saw a really badly done court-martial program. And like somebody has like a fake thing on their back. So there's some dude like fake whipping them and people are laughing and giggling. It's all very cheesy. Yeah, no, we wanted to do something that would really teach a lesson about military discipline, but could be done without it being just incredibly cheesy. So what we did is we went through these orderly books and we picked out cases where corporal punishment was not meted out, where the punishment was something non-corporal, so that we didn't have to have that cheesy moment of fake whipping somebody, right? And using that information, we essentially sat the visitors down for 30 minutes in a room and ran through a series of cases as if it was an actual court-martial. We had all the appropriate number of officers that we're supposed to have. We had all the little various bits and bobs, the important, I guess, players in the room, right? So that you can see what this actually looks like rather than just a silly dog and pony show. And that was great. That was really cool. The public very much connected with that. We did a thing where I mentioned, because the museum has, for example, our Irish farm, which is over in Ireland, right? We had visitors who were visiting our Irish farm had the opportunity to write letters to captive prisoners, to people who, you know, in this scenario were the captive neighbors, the brothers, the husbands, the fathers from this Irish community. Write letters and then hand deliver those letters to a specific reenactor named on the other side of the museum, over on the American side of the museum. So they got to work with the quill pens. They got introduced to this idea that, like, wait a minute, these are real people. These captives that you're looking at, these bad guys, these British and Hessian soldiers, they've got moms, they've got wives, they've got dads, they've got families, and those people miss them, right? And putting particularly kids in the situation of thinking about that all of a sudden humanizes the bejesus out of the big bad redcoat. We did a number of other different things, but I'm not going to bog down on that unless you guys really, really, really want to know. We can talk about it at the end. One other thing I will mention is, I think in the first presentation, Elizabeth, you had a really great photo where somebody was, or the visitors rather, the visitors were clearly not distraught, but shocked, like something was happening there. Whoa. We tried to create that effect by doing a program in which we more or less recreated the destruction of a playhouse that took place in Augusta County. When these British and Hessian prisoners were bored, they started putting on plays. They built this really dinky little stage, and the plays started getting really political, and the local yokels in Augusta County got tired of it, came and beat a bunch of them up and burned the place down. So unfortunately, we can't burn down entire structures at the museum. The fire marshal doesn't really vibe with that. So instead, what we did is we had them make this huge painted mural that went behind the stage, and we actually we had them put a play on. So on the visitor schedule, it says the prisoner is going to put a play on. Okay, cool. They sit down, they're watching the prisoners put this play on. We've got our guys up there doing a really rousing, very patriotic, rah-rah England Shakespeare play. And then about 5 minutes into it, we crack a gunshot off, and this group of angry civilians rolls up with torches, starts clapping dudes in irons, and sets that mural on fire. So all of a sudden, the visitor had that, like, whoa, what is going on here moment. It created in them the same sense of disbelief and what the heck is happening that those British prisoners experienced when their playhouse got burnt down. I think it was the last presenter talked about creating empathy with historic people. That's a great way to describe, I think, what we were shooting for with that. We had some great collaborations involved in this event. We had folks out from the Shawnee Nation to talk about Native experiences with captivity. Obviously, captivity is a really fraught subject within Native communities, but one that's often very misunderstood. So to have them out was great, as well as having people out from Colonial Williamsburg. We actually had official representation, people on the clock from Colonial Williamsburg. We very much hope that we'll be able to do direct on-the-clock collaborations with other museums in the future. The other event that I'll talk a little bit about is one that we did 2 years ago. This one's called Global Tempest. So the basic idea of the event is that the revolution is a conflict that spread across the globe, a tempest, a storm, right, that spreads across the entire globe and has effects all around the world. So where Captive Beyond the Mountains was very much focused on our American farms, right, on what's going on here in North America, Global Tempest was deliberately set up to be able to utilize our European farms. We wanted to show people what is happening in England, in Ireland, in Germany, places like that during the American Revolution. So we turned our English farm into a tavern, and as taverns are often recruiting bases for the British Army, had a recruiting party operating out of that space. Had the Royal Navy was there, also competing for recruits, doing a competing pitch to every visitor that came in. Do you want to join the Army? Do you want to join the Navy? Let's tell you why. We had Irish establishment appropriate impressions represented on our Irish farm. We had Hessians on the German farm. And then we also obviously talked about our Native American conflicts and the guys out in the frontier. So that one was much more of it leaned far more heavily on what impressions other people could already pull off. We didn't think it was realistic to say, okay, England is going to be the Gordon riots and it has to be these specific units because they were the units that suppressed the Gordon riots. Because we did that, we would have had like maybe 2 guys, wouldn't have worked out well. So rather than trying to totally shoehorn what we felt like was a good idea into the reenactors, we actually had them come to us with ideas. We said, what do you guys want to do that would be appropriate to these spaces? And they just threw tons of spitballs at the wall, and we picked out the spitballs that worked best and built an event around it. Particularly when we're talking about scenarios and events spanning the entire globe, it is not realistic for any one human or any one team to know everything about all these places. So there are just so many people out there who know more about what's going on in Ireland in 1777 than I do. So you know what? I'm not going to tell them that I know more. They can tell me what's cool, and we'll talk about it and figure out how it fits with the interpretive plans of the museum, right? As opposed to Captives, which was much more, no, we have a plan, this is what we're doing. Because we can't know everything, right? And I think one of the things that the last 2 presenters said very eloquently, and I'm going to say a whole lot less eloquently, is we can't do this without the reenactors. And there are a lot of reenactors and living historians out there, hobbyist living historians, who might know more about a specific thing than we do, and that's awesome. We want to leverage that information. We want people to come to us with that information because there are all kinds of cool stories out there, and it's impossible for any one person or any one team to know every single one. This year, we're going to run this event again in 2023. We're looking to make it a little bit more specifically thematic. The last time we ran the event, it was cool, but it was very much a grab bag of random stuff going on in the revolution in various places around the world. This year, we're trying to create a specific through line, a story, a narrative, so that as the visitor moves around the museum, there is a clear and coherent narrative, a clear point being made at every one of those farm stops with little internal points within the stops, so that by the time they leave the museum, they come out feeling like they've watched a movie or a play, something with a clear narrative, right? I'll talk a little bit about these last 2 items just because they were asked about in the email, and then I'll open it up to questions. We get asked about kit a lot. Yeah, how do you guys learn about kit? What kit is appropriate? Where are your standards? That kind of thing. For us, the best example I would give of how we research kit would be things like the public store records and Crockett's orderly book, right? For our Crockett's Western Battalion impression. When we're talking about military impressions, we have all these government sources that we can lean into and learn about what these guys are using. And of course, it requires some inference, right? We know that they got cloth. We know what color it was. We know how much they got. We know that they make coats out of it. We don't know what the pattern for the coats was, right? So we have to make inferences based on the quantity of cloth, what time frame of the war are we looking at, et cetera, to try and figure that stuff out. On the civilian side, we can look at runaway ads. Those are probably the best source that we have. Their runaway ads usually mention the county from which people ran away, so it's quite easy for us to go into any type of digitized newspaper database, punch in Augusta County, and see what spits out the other ad, see what differences we see in the clothing of people in a place like Augusta County out on the frontier, as opposed to a place like Williamsburg that's going to be far more cosmopolitan. If I had to describe our standards, I would say our standards are very specific to context, not as hyper-specific to stitch. We operate off of that very tried and true progressive hobby best acceptable, unacceptable model. And the best is always clearly going to be your hand sewn, well fit, yada, yada, yada. But depending on what a person's role is in an event, there are a lot of times where there is a good interpretive application for the Frontier Culture Museum, right? To have somebody who maybe has kit that isn't 100% hand sewn, but you know what? It fits and it's made out of appropriate materials, and the actual form of it is appropriate to the scenario we're looking at, right? I'd be far more annoyed by somebody showing up in, I don't know, I'm just going to make something up here, Philadelphia Associators coat that's like a perfect, beautifully hand-sewn Philadelphia Associators coat that's just not appropriate to the scenario we're doing than I do with somebody showing up with some machine stitching on their stuff. So that's roughly where we're at. We are not as hardcore as some, but are more hardcore than a lot, is how I'd say it. And finally, we talk about goals, right? And then I'll wrap it up. Our goal when we put these events on is to try and tell the less well-known stories throughout history. So everybody knows about the American Revolution, right? Everybody knows it happened. Not a lot of people, particularly in Augusta County, realize that there are about 1,000 dudes buried in unmarked graves in Augusta and Albemarle County who were veterans of the Saratoga campaign. They have no idea these dudes were here. They have no idea why Barracks Road in Charlottesville is called that. And it's named after the Albemarle Barracks, which is a prisoner of war camp, not an actual barracks for American troops. Stories like the stories of those Native people we talked about, trying to make sure that as we talk about captivity, that actual Native people are in that room talking about how their communities experienced enslavement, but also how they went about capturing and adopting other people and establishing the context to realize that this isn't just the scary kidnapping that you've heard about from your sort of Daniel Boone frontier stories. There's more to this than originally meets the eye. Things like the fact that the American Revolution didn't just take place in America, that it took place all over the world. We want to get those points across, things that people might not know about. We want people to come in, maybe they know a little bit, but hopefully having learned something totally new and hopefully thinking about history in a different way, thinking about the world in a different way because of what we've talked to them about and told them about. So I did not have a cool, slick PowerPoint like the rest of these guys, but I hope my verbal effluviation was at least somewhat interesting.
Fine job, very fine job. And I'm sorry you were under the weather this weekend, and I've been under the weather too. So kudos to you for showing up tonight and doing a great job, Davis. I follow you.
I'm on the mend now.
Yeah, you bet.
Do we have any questions?
Yes, other questions? I have a question. I always have a question. The question is about how, advice to newcomers. When you're working with people that are coming in new, they really want to step up. How do you work with those people? What do you advise? What's your advice, Davis?
It's tough. So I was lucky in that the time when I really wanted to step up, when I went from being a very bearded, very Farby rifle pirate type impression to really wanting to step up my game was around the time I started working at Colonial Williamsburg. So I had access to some of the greatest tradespeople on God's green earth to show me how to do stuff. That is not something that most humans are ever going to have access to, and I realize that. I'd say try to find somebody, even if it's just somebody you can send text messages to, but who can help walk you through some of the actual functional steps in the process. It would be really hard to be able to make any good kit that I've made without a lot of help. So if you're sitting there and you're trying to figure out how to sew a thing and you just can't figure it out and you're doing it all alone, don't worry. That's totally normal. Go ask for help, go look for help. There's all these groups on Facebook. There's all of these videos people have recorded now. Don't be afraid to ask for help is what I'd say. And don't be afraid to ask questions. Like if you're not sure if something is right or not generally, should I even make this garment at all? Don't be afraid to ask questions. You'll get some folks, especially on the internet, who will give you snarky responses and whatnot, but you will also get people who give kind-hearted, well-meaning answers.
Thank you very much. Excellent. I might ask Rebecca the same question of you. Any advice?
I mean, I think it's very similar to Davis. My advice would be ask questions. This community is not that, it's very, very intermingling. A lot of the people who do events at Elizabeth's site and at David's site also do events at our site. We have a lot of, there's no dumb questions. There's lots of different ways now, especially with the internet, to connect with people who have been doing this longer. Similar to Davis, I am very lucky that when I started getting into this, at a time when I was surrounded by people who had been doing this since they were 11. So I am very familiar. So I have people that I can turn around and ask questions to at a moment's notice. But yeah, find those people, and whether it's a Facebook group or it's staff, Elizabeth and Davis and I have all said that you're more than welcome to ask us questions and ask the staff that we work with questions at any time. Just go ahead and reach out and ask us ask other people. That's the other thing I have found in this community. And I can tell you as someone who's only been who hasn't been doing it as long as these other two people, is that, there's not a lot of people who are going to not want to answer your questions. If the things that we have in common are that, we love this era, we love the storytelling, and we love talking about it. And so we're going to talk about it if you're going to ask us questions, no matter what. So talk to us about it, and we will happily talk back.
And one last question for you, Liz, a little bit of a twist on this is research. I know we all, some of us thrive and love it, others don't. And for those who feel like sometimes they just hit a wall, or they can't seem to make the connection, how do you guide them through sticking with the research?
Well, I feel like in terms of research and learning, different people have different learning methods. So this can be very reading heavy, reading through a lot of information, which can be hard. People who have young families and jobs, especially. So finding other ways to intake that information. So videos, there's a lot of really great video content on YouTube, or finding podcasts by an expert speaker for a particular topic can be a good way to meet someone where their learning is at, where they can take that information in and start to absorb it. And then some people are visual learners. I feel like I fall into that category. So, for me personally, I have a pretty extensive Pinterest page with things pinned and organized, and I'm sure links are broken, but at least it's a good visual to remind me, oh, there's that print, and I just love that image, and I really want to make that, apron or neck handkerchief that's there, so I can go dig a little bit further and find it. So I feel like having a combination of ways to help people intake that information, and then also having a conversation. So something I'm trying more recently with our events, and since people are now more comfortable with these virtual formats, is having a meeting before an event where we can all get together and just talk about here's the goals that I've set, here's the research I've laid out, here's what I'm thinking everybody should do, here's what I can prepare for you all, what questions do you have, what did I forget? What did I miss in terms of preparing for this? So trying to communicate that way as well.
Thank you all three so very much. We really, really appreciate your first person frontline experience with not only planning, but participating and mentoring people who come, regardless of how long they're in the hobby. We out here, and all of us, I think there's 41 people were tuned in. There's 41 people tuned in. We follow what you do. We appreciate you. We really do learn from you, even from afar. Davis, Rebecca, and Elizabeth, thank you so very much.
And I wanted to let everyone know that we are recording this, and we will post access to the recording because some people joined late and fell off and came back in. And so we will keep that up for just a few weeks for those who may have missed. And I wanted to thank you as well. We're all working really hard to help people as we look to the 250th and help get people started on the right track and doing research and not making the same mistakes a lot of us did years and years ago. So thank you again, and I would bid everyone good night.
Real quick question. Can I plug a thing real fast?
Absolutely. Plug away.
In the chat, I'm dropping a Facebook group. It is the Facebook group for our 2023 big event, Global Tempest 2. So if that is a cool sounding thing, what I described earlier, you guys feel free to join the page. You can learn more about it, check out standards, all that fun stuff.
That's awesome. Thank you. I know our 32 plus attendees next weekend are going to really appreciate that, Davis. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you again. Good night.
Good night.